Where's the weakness in the pattern?
Irrigation artist.
The weakness happens to generally be right in the center, between the heads. This is going to generally be the dry spots. Yeah. Pretty nice, huh? Psychedelic. Take us back to the 60s. But those will be the weak spots. In between, see, here's the head. You just put an X in that pattern, and the problem's going to be in the center of the X. Put an X between those heads, that's where the problem is. Because between heads, man, we get great uniformity head to head. This way, we get great uniformity. In here, we get great uniformity, and so on. You know, all of these areas of the pattern, they're looking really good. All that perfect lap. Well, it starts to fall apart in the centers a little bit. So generally, that's going to be the weakest part. Now, we can approach but never get 100% perfect uniformity on a pattern. So the problem we end up with then is to get enough water in these drier spots, we have to overwater the rest of the area a little bit so that we get enough in those areas. And of course, the more sandy the soil, the more prevalent the problem is. The heavier the soil, the more silt and clay we have, the more capillary action, lateral movement we get of that water, and it'll actually work its way into the dry spots. Sand won't do that at all. You have to get it there on the sand. So you get out here on these USGA spec sand greens, there's no forgiveness. That pattern has to be perfect. The water doesn't move sideways on those sand greens. It moves straight down. I mean, it won't move sideways that far. It goes straight down or into the plant. You know, ideally we want it all to be absorbed by the grass. We don't want it to drain out. We don't want to overwater. But when we do overwater, down she goes, along with our nutrients. So that's a bad deal too. You know, overwatering creates added problems. Now the textbook has some good representation of this, and so you can look at that. Now it'll also note that when you start getting low pressure, instead of this nice pattern we're getting, all of a sudden the pattern looks a little different. We get our sprinklers sticking up here for low pressure, and what's it going to look like? Well, it's going to look kind of like a donut.
How about the weirdest looking donut ever?
Isn't that nice?
I want to eat that one.
So you get a lot of water out on the edges and right in close to the head if it's an impact. If it's a rotor, then you don't even get the water in close. It does this. That would be a rotor, because a rotor doesn't have that impact arm to break up that water and splatter close to the head itself. The impact would be the solid line, the rotor would be the dotted in close to the head. Now what they have to do with the rotor to compensate is they add those little side nozzles, those small little side nozzles, to break up, get some water in close. Without that breakup, you're kind of SOL on a rotor. Another thing you can do is drive a pin into it and diffuse it a little bit. That's another way that can be done, like we've talked about. But donut pattern meaning we get a lot of water out on the far ends, and so you see rings in a field. Someday when you're in an airplane, well, this is what will start happening to you. After you take this class, every time you fly, you're going to be looking down on the ground, seeing all the irrigated fields, and looking at how good the water patterns are, because you can really tell from up in the sky by looking straight down onto a field whether or not they have a good irrigation system, how good the water pattern is. And you'll see some good ones and you'll see some terrible ones. And you'll see fields that just look like a whole bunch of rings out across the field, a hand line or a wheel line that's running at too low a pressure, or a solid set that's running at too low a pressure over a whole season. All of a sudden, it'll just be rings of green and yellow areas in between them. And it just stands out just clear as a bell. Now they actually do aerial photography with infrared, and it really starts to show up then. If you just take the red light spectrum of the vision, and then you can really see the water pattern falling apart. But that's what happens when you get too low a pressure. You start getting too much water going to the far end of the pattern. So instead of this nice look here, you know, this thing all of a sudden it started looking like this sprinkler here with too high a water, with too low a pressure, its pattern would look something like that. And that's just pretty ugly.